Thanks for joining us with Lowitja Live. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're all on today. This is being shot on Ngunnawal and the Ngambri land, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us, and everyone else for joining us. So, we have Craig Ritchie from AIATSIS here. He's a Dunghutti man, and you're the CEO of AIATSIS.
That's right, yeah.
Now, for those that don't know AIATSIS, what's the acronym stand for?
It stands for the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies.
Fantastic. What does AIATSIS do?
So we're a 56-year-old organisation, and we began life as a research institute dedicated to researching, documenting, preserving Aboriginal culture back in the 60s. And we've extended that obviously to include our Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. And so we do much more than research now. We look after a collection that's the largest of its kind in the world that relates to our cultures and our heritage, continuing to research, publishing books, engaging in public programs, and providing advice to the Commonwealth on matters related to our cultures.
Yep. You have a fantastic library. I took my mum there, and I swear, if it wasn't closing time, she would never have left.
Yeah, we have to close so people can...
Yeah. Go home?
Yeah, otherwise we put them in the collection. And
it's probably where Mama Finlay fits sometimes, I think. So can you tell us a little bit about the journey you've had with Lowitja?
So I have a background in Aboriginal health, and so it was through the community controlled health sector when I was at NACCHO that I became aware of what was then the CRC on Aboriginal health. And so way back in the beginning, kind of not deeply involved, but aware of what now is the Lowitja Institute, and now, of course, I'm on the board of it. It's a wonderful institution.
Why is it so wonderful?
Its focus is on research that matters to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, stuff that matters to us, and it does that in the context of a community control model of governance, but also community control of research. And it's one of the problems, I think, that we've had to overcome and are still continuing to overcome, this idea of investigator-driven research, which is largely the brilliant idea of a non-Indigenous academic or researcher. They think that this is the question that needs to be investigated, but often those questions don't relate to things that matter to us as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. So
why is it really important that Lowitja is now community controlled?
Well, I think because, well, there's two reasons. One is a practical one and the symbolism of it. So the idea that there is a national community-controlled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research institution such as Lowitja is really, really important. I think we're at a point in our country's history where we're continually, having continued for so many years to prosecute the idea that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders can be in control of our own destiny, in a sense, to have an organisation that reflects that in the way that it's run and the way that it operates and the questions that it asks is really important. But also because of the role, or the importance rather, of Indigenous people being involved in priority setting and determining what it is we're investigating.
So when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are involved in priority setting, what difference does that make to the research?
Well, I think it anchors it much more in the realities of community life and the realities of the experience of Indigenous people. I remember years ago being at a research, it may even have been one of the earlier CRC meetings in Alice Springs, where this particular person was speaking, and he made this comment, I'll never forget. He said, "I don't care that you understand what the armpit of a staphylococcus looks like. If it doesn't help me deliver better services, I'm not interested."
Yep.
Now, two problems with that. Staphylococcus doesn't have armpits. But the point he was making was arcane research that's disconnected from the reality of a life as Indigenous people experience it, be it in the health field or any other field, is increasingly less valuable to us. So having Aboriginal people involved in decision making about what research is carried out and importantly how it's carried out, make sure that the outcomes of that are much more anchored to addressing the problems that we think are important in ways that we know will work.
Do you want to just unpack that statement around how important it is to how it's carried out, the research?
Well, it's important because traditionally, or historically rather, I should say, we've been the objects of research. So we've, in a sense, been passive in the process, other than as informants or, you know, the thing or the group that's being studied by outsiders, and so not partners in the research at all. So how research is done, both in terms of who is doing it, that we're actually partners in this. So it's not that knowledge is created by clever people from outside of Indigenous communities, but we're part of the knowledge creation process. And also that the manner in which research is done in a way that's consistent with our values, the way our communities work, our sense of ethics, and that is really, really indispensable. I mean, I can't imagine a research endeavour that doesn't proceed on the basis of ethics as we define them.
So when you talk about ethics as we define them, do you want to unpack that a little bit? Because it can mean so many different things to different people.
Well, ethics is part of, it doesn't exist apart from a person's worldview and a way we understand life. And ethics is fundamentally about right and wrong, right? And so we've been subject to research that often has been carried out based on the ideas of right and wrong of non-Indigenous people. And, you know, it's a happy coincidence in that circumstance where they happen to align, but far better for research to be done in a way that is respectful of our cultures, our values, and our sense of morality, if you want to put it that way. The product is inevitably better. Look, we're in advance of the world, I think, in terms of ethical research. There are parts of this world that if you're a clever academic and you've got some money, knock yourself out. So Australia leads the world, I think, in terms of ethical frameworks for research. And AIATSIS has had a long-term role in helping to define and codify research ethics in Indigenous contexts.
Yeah. So what excites you about research? Like if someone said to you, why would I want to get into research? What excites you that might motivate them?
Well, I have a particular view about the way that knowledge works. I think knowledge is constructed, and it's constructed from lots and lots of raw material that we call data, right? And so imagine being able to create new knowledge about old problems, or imagine being able to come up with the solution to a problem that no one else has been able to crack. And this is why I think Indigenous research and Indigenous-led research is so important, because one, we live in the context of many of these challenges, but also we've got a bit of a clue about what works. And the particular kind of knowledge that we create through our research, I think it has a different quality to it that is much more tuned to, I'm going to say the environment. I don't mean the environment, trees and rocks and plants. I mean the context in which people live.
Yeah, yeah. Research is like putting a painting together, isn't it? You don't quite know where it's going until it's finished.
Yeah, and you know, I'm a social scientist, so this idea that there is, you know, this thing out there somewhere called knowledge, and we discover it, just what I think is a silly idea. I think we make the knowledge, and who wouldn't want to be part of that?
Oh, I know. I love knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That's why I'm also a researcher. So you talked about some of the barriers, i.e. researcher-driven research. What are some of the other barriers that we face when we're actually entering into the research space?
Well, look, I think the fact that we've been, Indigenous people have been the objects of research for so long, and sometimes less than ethical research, as I've suggested, means that people can misunderstand what's going on or be resistant, and it's a perfectly understandable thing. I remember years ago being asked to consider approving a research project, so this is a long time before I came to Canberra. The promise made by this non-Indigenous academic was that if people gave her blood samples, she would tell them which mob they belonged to. So first of all, we already knew which mob we belonged to.
So many things wrong with that.
And so the project never happened. So that creates sort of a mistrust of the research community, and that's why, again, us being involved in as Indigenous people helps to break down that wall, because it's not clever white people coming to take something from us again. It's us and our own mob working in partnership to create something. I think there is also a degree of snobbery in the research community.
Yep.
Unless you're from a particular institution or a particular kind of institution, you're not really serious. And I think that's a real barrier, because that has implications then for funders of research about where they will direct their money.
And it's also about certain letters you may or may not have in front of your name.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, because our mob are really good at research, whether they've got those letters.
So I reckon research is a fundamentally Indigenous practice.
Okay.
And I've long argued that it's, in a sense, I'm a big supporter of higher education, so I think, but higher education is often presented as a foreign environment, but my view is it's a thoroughly Indigenous thing to do. How did our mob survive, and not just survive, but thrive in this continent for 65,000 years? We had a problem, we asked questions about it, we tried this way of doing something. If that didn't work, we did another. We're fundamentally very practical people, because you've got to live, right? So all of those things, investigation, research, experimentation, those kind of things, they're all part of how our mobs survived. We call it scholarship these days to make it sound flash,
Yep.
but it's basically our mode of living, right?
Yep. And that's why we're so good at knowledge translation.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's I think it's really fashionable for non-Indigenous people to think about, our view of the world, and that people will talk about our cosmology and all of this kind of stuff, because since, get a bit wanky here, but since the sort of 18th century, the Europeans have been working really, really hard to separate culture from life. So culture is this objectified, rarefied thing that's elevated and over there. It's different to life. Whereas for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, culture is life. There's no distinction between the ordinary, everyday lived life that we live in communities with our culture. So our stuff is inherently practical and about solving problems.
Yeah, fantastic. And just thinking about that, that's why as Indigenous peoples, when we come into the research space, we inherently do Indigenous methodologies, which has whole theoretical concepts around it. But
yeah. I mean, it does, but fundamentally it's about how we go about stuff. And as again, I keep coming back to this idea that our practice as Indigenous people involved in research is anchored in solving real problems and being able to live out our lives.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the fact we're so passionate about communities, we're connected.
Yeah.
That's why we need to do it. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about either the value of research or something you want to share with community more broadly?
Look, I'm really deeply, deeply committed to the idea of research. I'm, head of a research institution myself. Right now in a death roll with a PhD, because I think answering questions is really important. The real challenge is making sure that you're asking the right questions in the first place, and that's why, again, Indigenous leadership of this research endeavour is so important, because it means we'll be asking the right questions and then going about it in ways that are consistent with who we are as Indigenous people and our collective learning processes.
Do you have a saying that inspires you or gets you going when you're thinking things are a bit tough?
I have a saying, I'm not sure whether it applies in the circumstances where things get tough, but when I get a notebook, I write this saying in the front of it, and it's own the space.
Right.
So one of the things that we haven't been allowed to do, because Indigenous people historically have had our place defined for us by other people, and it's usually been on the fringe, not in the main game. Again, why Lowitja is so important, because it's us in the main game. Yeah. And so our space has been defined for us as over there. And we're in a time in our history now where we are defining our own space, and we have to own it.
Yep.
And that means we've got to occupy and be who we are in our own space. So that I write that in front of notebooks just to remind me, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, own that space.
Yeah, fantastic. And I have to say, as far as research is concerned and Aboriginal research, in my opinion, Lowitja is the game.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.